let's now implement dates in our application. And to see what we have to do, so where we have dates in our application, let's go to our demo here. And so we have the date first here, and then also in all of these movements. So each of them here, besides the deposit and the value itself, like we have it now, we also now need the date here. And so that's the reason why in our account objects, we actually now have the movement dates. It's so that we can display them here. But let's start with this date here. And actually the very first thing that I want to do is to basically fake it that we are always logged in. Okay, so let me do that here. Fake always logged in. And so this way we don't have to always log in each time we want to do something. So to that, let's set the current account to account 1. Then let's call update UI with that current account. And also we need to make the user interface visible with this here. Okay. So these 3 lines will now make it so that Jonas is automatically logged in, except for the message here, but that doesn't really matter. Okay. So as I was saying, let's start by displaying the current balance here. So as I was saying, let's now create this date here. Okay, and let's check out the class name. So that's as always a little bit hidden. So it's the class date. Okay, and so that is already selected at label date. And once more, let's start by setting this date outside here of any callback function so that we can see the effects as we implement our code. So anyway, let's start by creating the current date. And so remember, that is simply by doing new date. And so that is basically right now. However, we don't just want to print that. So let's see how that would look like. So label date, as I have already selected, which again is this element with the class of date. And then text content, and let's set it to now. And so this result here is not exactly what we want, right? So instead, we really only want the day, the month, and the year. And I want to display it in this format. So I want day, then month, and then year. And so this is how we display it in Europe, or at least in Portugal, where I am located. Okay. Now, of course, you can format it in any way that you want, for example, how it looks like in your country, but I will do it like this now. Now, later in this section, we will learn about something called internationalization, which sounds very complicated, but it will allow us to format dates and time according to the user's location, basically. So if the user was in Portugal, then the date would automatically be formatted this way. But if the user was, for example, in the US or in India or wherever, then the date would be formatted in the way that it is usually formatted in that country. All right? So to do this, we need to get the day, month, and year. So let's create variables for each of them. All right. So we take now, and then we call the getDate method, just like we learned in the last video. Then let's take the month, which is now.getMonth. And remember that this one is 0 based. So I'm going to add 1 here. And then the year, which is now .getFullYear. And actually, let's also get the hour and the minute so we can display that as well. So get hours and const the minutes, get minutes. Okay, and now that we have that, all we have to do is to build a nice string with that. So that's the day slash the month slash the year. And then I want a comma and the hour and the minute. So min. All right, and that looks a lot better. Now here in Portugal, whenever the month and the year is only one digit here, then we usually write 08 and 02. So basically we pad this number here with a 0 on the left. All right, so let's do that with the day and with the month, because this is actually a good use case for this method that we studied earlier. So on the day and on the month, we want to use dot pad start. And actually this needs to be a string now. And so let's make it a template literal. Like this. So basically this is now a string. And so on that string, we can call pad start. And then we want this always to be 2 characters long. And we want to pad it with a 0. And probably just writing 0 would work just the same. And so now we get 02. But if the day would be, let's say, 12, then that 0 would not be added because the final length that we're looking for is always 2. Okay, and the same with the month. So let's copy it here. And beautiful. So that looks perfect. And now let's move on to actually use the dates here on the movements. Okay. Just keep in mind that, of course, as the time goes on, this value here is not going to change. So this is static, right? So if we wanted to keep displaying the actual time, we would need something called a timer, which is something that we will do by the end of the lecture. We will not do it for this, but we will implement a timer like this. Maybe you have seen it counting down here. So this logout timer. All right, so this time here is going to stay static, but yeah, that's not a big deal for now. But anyway, let's now go to the function which displays these movements. So display movements. So here it is. All right. And so now besides the movements, we also want to display the times of these movements. But now we actually have a problem, because into this function, we are only passing the movements array itself, right? However, we also want the, let's see, we also want the movement dates. And so the best thing to do is to simply pass in the entire account into this function here as well. So just like we already have it in these two, where we already passed in the entire account, let's do the same here as well. So just the account. And then here we need to say account.movement and here account.movements. And finally, where we call this function, we then need to pass in also the entire account. And so that's here in the display UI function. Okay. And so now it is a good thing that we have this refactored function that we created in the last section, where we call all of these methods here only in one place. And so now we only needed to change calling this display movements function here in this one place. And so that's the whole goal of refactoring. It is making it easier to implement new features as time moves on. All right. So let's see how we could do that. So in here, we are looping over the movements. So that's this array that we compute here, which is whether the sorted movements or simply the movements themselves, right? So we are looping over this, and in each iteration, we are generating this HTML. And so now we simply need to add one more element here to this HTML, which is going to contain that date. So let's do that. So in our HTML, we can see that there is this element here called movement date. So let's copy that and paste it right here after the type. Okay. And so let's actually create a variable out here and then put that variable right here. Let's call it display date. Okay. Now, where is the date actually coming from? Well, as we already know, it is in the accounts.movement dates, right? And so here we are looping over the movements. And so at the same time, basically, we also need to loop over the movement dates. Okay. But that's not a problem because we already have the index here. And so what we can do is to write account or ACC dot movement dates, and then we take it at position I. So that is the current index in the movements array, and the same index is then going to point to the equivalent date in this movements date array. All right. So this is a common technique of looping over two arrays at the same time. So we call the for each method on one of them. So that's the movements. And then we use the current index to also get the data from some other array. Okay. And so that's going to be at the same position because we're using the same index. So let's create a new date out of this, because as we saw before, this is going to be a nicely formatted time string, right? And so we can use that string to create a new date object. And we need that object so that then from there we can call our usual methods to get the date and the month and the year. Okay, so that's the reason why we need to convert these strings back into a JavaScript object, because only then we can actually work with that data. And now let's actually create these same variables that we already have here. So there's no need to repeat it all. Let's actually get all of this and then delete what we don't need to make this a little bit faster. So we don't need the hour and the minute. So we don't need this. And we want to create this variable called display date. So the date that we're ultimately going to use here. Display date. And now here we need to change from now to date like this. All right. And we see it already worked. Great. So let's compare it actually here with the dates. So July 12, 2020. And yeah, that works. Here then we have 11, which for some reason is also 12. But I guess it's because we're close to midnight here. And so for some reason, probably it then changes over to the next day. Then here we have 27 of May. And so that's also what we get here, all the way to the last one, which is 18 of November, so 2019. So this is accurate. Great. Now, when we click here on the sort, it's probably not going to work. So we get some kind of error here. So cannot read property slice of undefined. Let's see why that is. Well, that's weird, because account.movements here is clearly defined. It shouldn't be undefined. Let's set this here to true by default. And so, well, now it is sorted. So very weird that we get this bug as we click here. let's just log to the console. But indeed, this one here will be not undefined. But actually it now is undefined. So we get account.movements is undefined right now. And that's weird. But I guess it has something to do with the fact that we faked or log in here. So never mind. Let's take a look at this later. Okay, let's just not sort for now until we are back to having our application normal. All right. So actually, let's take this code here now and put it into the code that is executed when we log in. So besides this welcome message, we then also want to create the current date. Okay, so it's back to the original now. Let's now log in. And then we get the message here and the correct date. But now what I wanted to show you is what happens when we request a loan. So you see that we get this error here, right? And that's because this movement doesn't have any date, right? And that's why we get not a number in all the three values. So we need to fix that. So essentially, whenever there is a new transfer or a new loan, we need to not only push the new value into the movements array, but also into the movement dates. All right. So let's actually see that in code. So that's account 1. And so we see that the movements has now 9 elements, while the dates only has 8. All right. So we need to fix that. So let's come here to the transfer. And then besides doing the transfer and updating the UI, we also need to add transfer date. But that's easy enough. All we have to do is current account dot movement dates dot push, and then simply create the current date. So new date, and that's it. So JavaScript will then automatically convert this date here into a nicely formatted string. All right. And now the same here also for the receiver, because the receiver also gets a new movement here. Okay. And so they also need a new date for that movement. Now, as I told you also in the last section at the beginning of the project, in the real world, we would probably have an object for each movement. And so that object would then contain the amount, the date, and some other information about the movement. But I don't want to restructure the entire application now, and so therefore I simply created this separate movements dates array. All right. Now let's just take this here and also add it to the loan. So that's right here. So add loan date, and that should be it. So just to make sure here, let's really log in again. All right. And now I'm going to request this loan. And now we get the current date. So August 2nd, just as we have it up here. Okay. So let's see now the account. So account 1. Let's take a look at the movement dates. And so indeed, this is the one, or actually this is the one that I just added. So this looks a little bit different from these ones, because actually it is really the object itself. All right, so that's not good. So let's instead use the toISO string right here on the date and do the same also up here. Okay, and let's see if that fixes it then. Okay, so probably there was some error here because we're back to having not a number. And, oh, actually I need to take a look at account 1 now again. And so let's check out the latest date. Oh, and I didn't call the method. Ah, that was stupid. Actually, this is something that happens to me quite frequently with these date methods, because we don't have to pass anything in there. And so there's a tendency to forget that we even need to call the method. So don't make that same mistake. All right, and now it works indeed. So let's check if the string looks nice with the same format as all the others. And yeah, it does. And so with this, we finished one more lecture. Now here, I'm actually seeing something weird. So it's 19.1, but this should kind of be 0.1, shouldn't it? So we need to apply some padding to that as well. So that's a good coincidence that we are just at this time where I can see this. So let's go ahead quickly and fix that right here in the login callback. So that's here. And so essentially what we just need to do is to add this part to the hour and to the minute. So we make all of them a template literal again. And then like this. One more time. Okay. To see the effect, we need to log in. And beautiful. So that's a lot better. And now we indeed finished this lecture and are ready to move on to the next one, where we're going to work just a little bit more with dates. Let's now perform some operations with dates. So one cool thing that we can do with dates is to do calculations with them. For example, we can subtract one date from another date in order to calculate how many days have passed between the two dates. And this works because whenever we attempt to convert a date to a number, then the result is going to be the timestamp in milliseconds. And with these milliseconds, we can then perform calculations. So again, the timestamps are going to be really helpful here in this situation. So let's get this date here. Okay, and let me just demonstrate what I just said. So I will convert to a number this future. So you see, it worked. And the same thing is going to happen when I use the plus operator on it. So you see, and so in fact, that does mean we can now do operations with it. So if we subtract one date from another, the result is going to be a number like this, so a timestamp in milliseconds, and then we can simply convert these milliseconds back to days, or to hours, or to whatever we really want. So let's actually now create a function that takes in two dates, and it's going to return the number of days that pass between these two dates. So days passed is going to be a function, or let's use an arrow function. So a nice one-liner. So date 1 and date 2. And then all we need to do is date 2 minus date 1. And so let's suppose that date 2 is later. But in case we do not want to suppose that, we can simply take the absolute value here. And then it doesn't matter which of the dates here happened first in time. But for now, let's keep it like this so I can show you later what I mean. So for now, let's actually also return this result. And then I will just call this function here. So calc, or actually it's just called, well, it should be called calc. So this looks a bit nicer. So calc days passed. And then let's just create 2 dates here. So let's use this one here. Maybe make it a little bit simpler. Let's say here April 14th. So this is the first date, the first that happens in time. And then the second date, let's just say, well, April 24th. So this then makes it easy for us to visualize the result. And let's just call this const days1 and then log it to the console. All right. And so this gives us these milliseconds. And so now we just need to convert them. And this is similar to what we did, I think, in one of the previous lectures. So we want to divide by 1000. And so this converts milliseconds to seconds. Then that times 60 to convert it to minutes. Then times 60 to convert it to hours. And then times 24, which converts it to days. And again, that's because there are 24 hours in a day. There are 60 minutes in 1 hour, 60 seconds in 1 minute, and 1000 milliseconds in 1 second. And so now we get 10 days. And that makes sense, right? So from April 24 to April 14, we have exactly 10 days. Now what if here we pass 4? So now it's going to be the other way around, right? So now we have minus 10, but we don't want that. We always want it to be 4. And so that's what I meant earlier, where we can now simply take the absolute value of this. So math.absolute. Which of the dates we pass in first. So if we now put 4 here and 14 here, then the result is still going to be 10. Great. So this works just really nice. Now, if you need really precise calculations, for example, including time changes due to daylight saving changes and other weird edge cases like that, then you should use a date library like moment.js. And that's a library that's available for free for all JavaScript developers. But for something simple like this, we should be fine. Now let's just consider that one of these days here also has some time. So let's say in this one here, it's also 10 in the morning or 10 hours and 8 minutes. Doesn't really matter. But let's see what happens to the days now. And so indeed, we now get 10.4. So we might not want that. And in this case, we can simply use math.round on all of this. Okay, so keep that in mind. But I will just leave it like this. All right. And now let's actually use this function to format and display our dates in a little bit nicer way here in our application. So basically what I want to do is if one movement happened today, then here instead of the current date, I want to display today. Then if it happened yesterday, I want to write yesterday. And then if it happened like a couple of days ago, then I want this to say like 2 days ago or 5 days ago instead of the date. And I'm sure you have seen this kind of stuff in many web applications that you use in your daily life. For example, if you post something on Facebook and if you then watch it the next day, it will say that you posted it yesterday. It's not going to display the exact date if it was just yesterday. And so that's a really nice use case of using a function like this. So let's grab this here. So I'm copying it. And then let's go to the display movements function where we do actually print the date. Now this is all kind of getting out of hand. So we have a lot of extra code here. And now we will add even more. So this function here and even some more stuff. And so let's take all of this here and actually create a new function which will have the purpose of formatting this. All right. So let's cut this here as I just said, and create a function up here just to make it a little bit more modular. All right. And then we could also reuse this function in some other place, even though right now, in this case, we don't need it. I'm just doing this to split up the functionality a little bit across different places in our code. Okay. So this one receives a date as an input, and it will return the formatted date then. Okay. So I'm copying all of this, but actually this one should stay back here where we got it from. And then also, so this, we need this variable back here where it came from. So display date, because we use it down here as the value that we eventually want to print to the user interface. And so this one should actually be the result of calling our new function. So this format movement date. So format movement date, and here we pass in the date variable that we just created up here. All right. And so with this, we just exported the functionality here into a new function. So let's grab this and put it here at the top of the scope. And so for now, just to keep this working, let's return then this value. All right. And as you see, and let's just make sure by logging in. So as you see, the dates are now still being correctly printed. So we successfully exported this functionality here of displaying the dates into this function. And now we can just implement what I just said. So basically calculating how many days passed since the current date and between the date that we are working with. All right. So let's say const days passed and between. So between right now, that is new date. And then the second date is the date that we just received here. So let's just print this to the console to see if it works. Okay. So what's all of this here? So we are printing here actually the wrong thing. So we want days passed. So that was a mistake, obviously. But it's still not correct. And okay, I have another mistake. So probably you saw this already. So I did not even call the calc days passed function. But now it should be good. And indeed, now we have our days here. All right. And now let's actually round them. Okay, so that's what I was just saying earlier, so that we should probably round these dates. So we already learned how to do that. So math.round all of this. And so this looks a lot better now. Now let's actually modify our dates here a little bit. And you should do the same. And what I'm going to do is to make one date yesterday, and then also a date like 3 or 4 days ago. So see what's your current date, and then simply subtract 1. So for me, it's August 2nd. So I'm going to use August 1st, and then also July 28th, and maybe another July here, 25, or maybe 26. Okay, it's just so that we can see like the yesterday or 3 days ago or something like that. All right, so do that now, and then let's go back here to our function. And then we want to implement some logic based on this day passed. So if days passed is 0, and so basically that is if we do something today, then actually the string that we want to print is not the current date, but instead today. All right. Then if 1 day has passed, we want to return yesterday. Okay. Next up, let's say if the number of days passed is within the last week. So that's less or equal 7. And then we will return the number of days. So days passed, days ago, and else. So only if more than 7 days have passed, only then we want to return the actual date. Okay, does that make sense? So let's save and see if it works. And yes, beautiful. So that's yesterday, 5 days ago, 7 days ago, and then here the other dates right here. So that's beautiful, great. Let's now just do something. And actually let's transfer like 500 to Jessica Davis. And that's gonna be the other way around. Jessica Davis 500. And so now we should get one log here with today. Yes, indeed, there is today. And now if we log in as Jessica Davis, we should get the same. So now we have a deposit coming from today. And actually we also have something from 7 days ago. So great, that's amazing if you ask me, that we are capable of now doing something like this, which looks like a real web application that you might use every day. All right. Now, maybe the logic here is a bit confusing with all of these returns, but that's completely normal. So as you know, once we return, the function stops executing. And so these other returns will then never be reached. And so this is a pretty common technique. And actually we wouldn't even need this else. So if I just remove this here, then all of this code will only be executed if all of these here are not executed. So only if all of these here are false, the rest of the code is even executed. So you see it works the exact same way. Awesome. So our application is even better now. And in the next 2 lectures, we will then do what I mentioned earlier, which is internationalization, which is to basically format these dates and also these numbers here according to each of the countries of these accounts. So JavaScript has a new internationalization API. Now that sounds very fancy, but all it does is to allow us to easily format numbers and strings according to different languages. So with this new API, we can make our application support different languages for users around the world, which is pretty important. For example, currencies or dates are represented in a completely different way in Europe or in the US or in Asia, for example. Now, there is a lot of language-specific things that we can do with the internationalization API. But in this section, we're just briefly going to talk about formatting dates and numbers. And starting with dates in this video. So in our application, we have dates in 2 places. First right here, and then second here in each of these movements. Now, in case you're wondering why these labels like today or yesterday or 5 days ago are gone here from my application, it's just because I'm recording this video a couple of days later. All right. But anyway, let's go to the place in our code which displays this first date here, so that we can format that according to different languages and see what it looks like. And so that is right here in the login handler function. And in particular, this is the code that we have currently. Remember doing this? But now we will actually be able to get rid of all of this and simply replace it with the internationalization API. So it will do this kind of formatting for us automatically. But for now, let's actually display this date here outside of the login so that we can experiment a little bit with this API without having to log in all the time. So I will grab the current date experimenting with the API. Okay. And then we also need to get just this part where we do then actually display something in the DOM, right? So we want to set this text content property here to something. And we want to set it to a formatted date. And so let's now use the internationalization API for that. So that's new. And then intl. And so that's basically the namespace for the internationalization API. And then for times and dates, we use the .date time format function. Okay. Now all that we need to pass into this function here is a so-called local string. And this local is usually the language and then dash the country. So something like this. So English and then dash US, for example. All right. And so all of this here will create a so-called formatter for this language in this country. So English.us. And I will show you a list of many different locales here in a second. But for now, let's get started with this one. So all of this creates a new formatter. And then on that formatter, we can call .format. All right. And then here we actually pass in the date that we want to format. So that's now. And that's actually it. So let's reload here. And you see that now the date is actually formatted just like it is usually formatted in the US, with the month first and then the day. Now English is also spoken in other languages. So let's try the UK now, or Great Britain. So for the UK, we have to use this one. And now you see that it is different. So you have the day first, then the month, and it also has this leading 0 here. And so you see that now it is actually formatting this date for this exact locale that we specified here. And so just with this one line of code, we have correctly formatted the date for any user around the world. And let's try some other countries here as well. For example, we could try Arabic for Syria. So that would look like this. So in these symbols that I cannot really understand, but what matters is that it is indeed formatted correctly. Let's just put it back here. All right. And to get these different codes, let's just Google ISO language code table. And then the one that's easiest to understand is this one here. So go to the one that has lingos.net, and then from there you can find your own code and then experiment with that and see if it's also correct. All right. Now this is the most straightforward way of formatting dates and times, but we can actually take it to the next level and add some options to also customize this a little bit. For example, you see that right now it only displays the date here, but not any time, right? And so we can change that by providing an options object to this function here. So let's define that options object outside here. And I'm simply calling it options. And so all we have to do is to specify the hours property, or hour, and set it to numeric. And the same for the minute, set it to numeric as well. And now we have to then provide this object here as a second argument into the date time format function. So options. And of course we could have written this object right here, but I will add some more stuff to it in a second. And then this line of code here becomes a little bit messy. So it's quite usual to have a configuration object like this one here defined outside. So, as you see, now we get indeed the time. But on the other hand, now the date is gone. So let's get that back as well. And here we can specify properties for each of weekday, year, month, and day. So let's start with the day, and I will set it to numeric as well. So let's see what happens then. And so now we only get the day. Let's add the month as well. Numeric again. And so now we get the month here as 8. Okay, and that's because we specified it as numeric. But for month, we can also write long. So let's see what happens then. And so now we get August, and so not just the number. And for the month, there is even another option, which is 2-digit. And so then it would be 08. But let's leave it at long. And now the year as well. Let's set it to numeric. And of course in quotes. All right. So that's 2020. But we could also say just 2-digit. And so then it would be 20. But again, let's leave it as numeric. And finally, we can even specify the weekday. And here I'm using long again. And so then it will write out the day completely. So Wednesday, August 12, 2020. And all of this nicely formatted, just like people in the US do it. All right. Now here we can also say short or narrow, and you can experiment with that. So let's see what it would look like in the UK. So that's pretty similar. But now let's see, for example, Portugal. So PT-PT. And so now you will see this here, of course, written all in Portuguese. And the same, of course, for other locales, so for other languages. Now, in many situations, it actually makes more sense to not define the locale manually, but instead to simply get it from the user's browser. And so that's pretty easy to do as well. So let's define another variable here outside. So locale, and then that's simply navigator dot language. So let's log it here to the console first. So you see that mine here is set to English, Great Britain. And so if I replace this here now, then you will see that it will go back here to displaying it in English. All right. And so if you do this yourself now, then your date should be displayed to whatever language you have in your browser. Anyway, let's now take this and actually put it here into our login. So replacing all of this, I will just comment it out to leave it here. And now we have a duplicate here. Let's get rid of that. So now the date will only get formatted when the user actually logs in. All right. But now let's take a look at our account objects here. And so you see that now in each of the accounts, I defined a locale, right? So account 1 is Portuguese and the other one is in English. And so let's now actually use these locales to display Jonas's date here in the Portuguese format and Jessica's date in the American format. Okay, so that's easy enough. We just have to find the correct place in our code. So yeah, that's right here. And remember that we have the account in the current account variable. And so here, instead of using this locale that's coming from the browser, so instead of using this, we use current account.locale. So let's give it a save. And now I will log in as Jonas. And remember that should now display in the Portuguese format. And indeed, it does. Now the problem here is that our entire user interface is in English, but now I have this weekday here in Portuguese and also this month name. So to fix that, let's actually set the month here back to numeric and also get entirely rid of the weekday. So let's try that again. So we got rid of the Portuguese words here, but the formatting still follows the official Portuguese way. Now let's check out Jessica Davis. And so you see it looks different now. It is now in the American format with the month first and then also with the AM time down here. And of course you can set one of these accounts to your own language to see how it would look like in your language to make it a little bit more personalized for yourself. Great. So with this we have localized this date here. Now we need to do the same with the dates down here in the movements. So let's go to that function which formats these dates. Remember we created a function for that up here. So that is format movement date. Okay. Again, let's now do this formatting here also for these movements. And so what we're going to do is to replace all of this here with a new nicely formatted date. So instead of returning all of this here like we did before, we will simply return new and then again the intl namespace date time format, and then here we need the locale, and so let's actually pass that into the function. All right, so this function right now only receives a date, but we also now need a locale. So let's add that here as a second parameter. And now wherever we call this function, and that is down here, so here we now need to pass in that locale, of course. And so that comes from the account.locale. So the current account in here is called ACC, remember? And so that locale is at acc.locale. All right. So return new date format and then simply the locale that we receive here. And then format the date. And so that's again the date that we receive as an input here. Okay, and that's it. And in this case, we don't want any options object because here we don't need the hours or the minutes. All we want is to simply display the date as simple as possible. And in that case, we don't even need any options. So let's give it a save here. Try it now with Jessica Davis. And you see that indeed, now it is the American format with the month first like this. Let's just transfer some money here to Jonas. And so of course here our today still works. So these kind of easier to read and understand labels that I showed you earlier. So that is the American format. And now let's again see Jonas format, which should now change to the Portuguese one. And indeed, it did. And so this part is now working as well. Great. So in a nutshell, this is how we localize dates in JavaScript using the new internationalization API. And as always, feel free to read the documentation on MDN. So that's just MDN intl. And so here you're going to find all kinds of different functions. So I mentioned in the beginning that there's all kinds of stuff we can do with this API. So besides dates, so we can also format lists or like words and their plurals. All right. But if you want to learn about this one a little bit better that we just used, you can go ahead and read the documentation right here. In the next video, we will use this number format function here to format all the remaining numbers that we have in our application. So let's move on and do that now. So in the last video, we formatted dates using the internationalization API. So now let's actually format regular numbers. And let's start by doing some experiments in the console first before we move on to our application. So I'm just defining some number here. It doesn't really matter which one, just so we can experiment with it a little bit. Okay, so let's do the most basic formatting now, simply doing new, and then again, this intl namespace. And now this time we use number format. And so this, again, takes in a local string. And so let's experiment with the US. Okay. And so all of this here creates a formatter. And then one more time on that, we can call the format method, where we then pass in what we actually want to format. And so that is this number. Let's just also log here to the console that this is about the US, so that we can then have some other locales as well. Okay, so you see that the number is now formatted using these dividers here. So these commas here as separators, so that it's easier to read 3,884,000 and so on. But let's see how it works in other countries. So in Germany, for example, it is different. Let's add some spaces here. Okay. And so here we want like this. And since we're doing this, let's try some other countries here as well. Let's just say Syria. Why not? So the one that I used earlier as well. So that is Arabic, and then the country is SY. And you see that in Germany, as in general in Europe, the separator is the dot, and then a comma for the decimal part. So basically just the opposite as it is in the US, as you see here. And then for Syria, well, it's even more different. I cannot even read this, of course. And of course, we can also just use the locale from the browser. So that will be navigator.language. And actually, let's log that here. And so, yeah, in the UK, it's basically the same as in the US. So again, this is just the most basic formatting, but let's now define an object here. So again, options for this formatting. But of course, now we have other properties in this object. It's no longer day or month or something like this, but instead we can specify the style, for example. And here we can say that this is a unit, and then we can set the unit property to something. And let's say mile per hour. And there are tons of units like this. And so as always, you can read more about the units that are available in the documentation. But let's see what happens now. No, but apparently nothing happens. Now we just need to pass in this options here, of course, into the number format function. So again, as a second argument, and let's do that here in all of the 4 at the same time, using these multiple cursors. And let's give it a save. And indeed, now we get this unit here. And one more time, you see that it's written differently in the US or in Germany, for example, or in Europe in general. And you see in Syria or in Arabic, apparently this is how you write miles per hour. Okay. But of course we can try others. For example, for temperatures, there is Celsius. And so indeed, we get degrees Celsius. So that is for units, but we can also say percent, and then the unit is completely ignored. So we get the percentage sign, and again, it is different in different countries. So here we have this space. And then there's also currency. So these are the three different options for the style. So that's unit, percent, or currency. And again, if we have a currency, then the unit is just completely ignored. But we do have to then define the currency. So let's say euro, and for that, it is like this. So EUR. And so if we give it a save, then we get indeed the euro sign. And so here in Europe, it comes after the number, and in the US, it comes before the number. And it's important to understand that we do indeed have to set this currency here, because the currency is not determined by the locale. Okay, so it's not defined by the country here, because it's of course possible to show, for example, euros in the US. All right, and so of course we have to define the currency here manually. So it's not going to be implied from the locale string. Okay. Finally, we can also turn off or on the grouping. So let's use grouping and let's experiment with false. And then you see that the number is just printed as it is without the separators, so the grouping. But let's get rid of this one here. And again, if you're interested in even more properties that you can set here in the options, then just check out the documentation here on MDN. Okay, but now what we're going to do is to actually use this knowledge and implement currencies here in our application. So let's move up here, and I'm going to start here in the movements. So where is that function? Now you see we have a lot of code here already, and in the real world we then split up all this code into different files, okay? Because as it is right now, it is indeed a little bit messy, but for now it is just okay as we have it. Now, anyway, right now we are displaying the currency here in these movements right here. So we convert everything to 2 decimal places, and then we display the euro sign here ourselves. But now we want the internationalization API to take care of all of this. So let's create a variable out here so that we don't have to do all that formatting here in the template literal. So we do it outside here. So let's call it formatted movement. And then again, we use new and then number format. And now you already know that we have the locale right in the account object. And so that's again ACC, right? So just as we did here for formatting the date, we use acc.locale. And then we also need an options object. And this time, let's actually write that object right here. So we need to set the style to currency. And then we need to define the currency property. So just as we did earlier in this video. And let's just experiment a little bit here. Let's say that we want US dollars instead of euros. Okay. And so now here we can get rid of all of this, including the euro sign, and now simply use this value. So formatted movement. Okay, give it a save. And now we need to, of course, log in here. But before doing that, I see already that we have some problem here with this object. And the problem is that we here didn't even call the format method. So all we did was to define this variable here as number format. And so that's then this formatter, remember. But on that, we then need to actually call the format method. And so this is where we pass in the value that should be formatted. And that is simply the current movement. So this mov value here. So if I save it now, then that should be fixed. And indeed, you already see US dollars right here. But anyway, let's log in as Jonas now. And yeah, everything is US dollars. However, the number itself here is of course still formatted in the Portuguese way. So that's the current locale of the current user. Remember? So that's Jonas, and the locale is PT. Remember? And so therefore, the number is still formatted in that way and not in an American way. That's only for the currency. Okay? So that's USD, but the rest is still according to the user's locale. So that's what I said earlier, that the currency is completely independent from the locale itself. So in this case, we have a European country with an American currency. All right. Now, indeed, we also have the currency in the accounts object. So we have the locale and also the currency. And so let's now get that currency also from the account itself. So that's right here. And so here we actually want account.currency. So if I load it now, then indeed we get euros. All right. And if I log in as Jessica Davis, which has USD as the currency, then we get the dollars, and we get it also formatted in the American way. Because for Jessica Davis, the locale is also it is English in the US. And so this is what it looks like here, formatted for the US with US dollars. Of course, we could change this to euros, and then, of course, now we would have the euro sign. All right. So one more time, you can see how powerful this is and how easy it makes formatting for us developers. Okay. Now, anyway, that is the movements, but now we also have the currency in a lot of other places. For example, here in the balance, and then also down here in these statistics. So let's start to also implement the same formatting here in the balance. And so that is, that's right here. Okay, so here we also have this old way, basically, of formatting, but we know that we can do better. So we can now go ahead and grab all of this like this and paste it here and then use this. Okay. However, as you can guess, that is not a good practice because we are repeating the don't repeat yourself principle. Right? So let's get rid of this. And as you can guess, we will create a new function here, which will take care of formatting the currencies. So let's call it format cur, which stands for currency. So a new function. And let's create a very reusable function here. So instead of passing a whole account object into this function, which is very specific, of course, to this exact application, let's do a function that you could use in any other application. So basically a function that is less dependent on the underlying application data. Okay, and so instead, what we will do is to simply pass in all the data that this function needs to work with. So that's the value, the locale, and the currency. Okay, so again, we could pass the entire account object here instead of these two, but here we just want to do a reusable function. And so this is a lot better for that. All right. So this is the code that we had written earlier. And here we don't even need to create a new variable. All we will do is to return the result of this number format function. Now we just need to adapt this a little bit. So here it's just the locale that we get in here as an argument. And then here the same for the currency. And what we want to format is the value that we get in. All right. So again, a nice and simple reusable function that can take any value, any locale, and any currency, and will then return this value here nicely formatted for that locale and currency. So let's use that here. So of course, instead of what we had before, formatted mov will now become format the currency, and then the value is mov, the locale, which I think is the second one. Yeah, it is. So it's very handy, again, here in VS Code to just hover over the function name. So the locale is at account.locale, and the currency at account.currency. And so we can get rid of this. Now I will just copy this part here. And so now what we want to format is account.balance. Okay. And we actually don't even have to store it into a separate variable first. We can just take this result directly and then display it as a text content here in our application. So if I log in now as Jonas, then this should already be nicely formatted, and indeed it is. So we see we have this nice separator here, which makes our number easier to read. And now as Jessica Davis, it should be the American separator, so with the comma here. Okay, so that's great. All that's left now is these three values down here. All right, but that should be easy enough with the function that we already created. So let's just copy it here. And then we simply basically need to paste it here to these three places. So here it is the incomes that we want to format, right? So incomes. Then here it is this part here. So the absolute value of the out. And then finally down here, it is the interest. Now I copied that code from earlier. So again, it is this interest that we want to format now. So interest. And indeed, you can already see, even without logging in, that it worked down here. So we have this nice separator here indeed. And so if we log in again with Jessica Davis to see it as US dollars, then we get this nice result here as well. Beautiful. And actually, that's it for the internationalization API. That's all I had to show you. But as I told you right in the beginning, there is a lot more potential in this API. To finish this section, let's quickly talk about timers in JavaScript. And we have two kinds of timers. First, the setTimeout timer runs just once after a defined time, while the setInterval timer keeps running basically forever until we stop it. So basically, we can use setTimeout to execute some code at some point in the future. So let's use this to simulate ordering a pizza. So when we order a pizza, it doesn't arrive right away, right? So instead, it's going to take some time, and we can simulate that. So let's write setTimeout, And then this function receives a callback function. So just like some array methods or DOM event handlers, right? And we already talked a lot about this. And I think we even used the setTimeout function here as an example of callback functions a bit earlier, right? So let's use an arrow function this time, actually. Because why not? And so here, let's just say, here is your pizza. And then just some pizza emoji here, maybe. All right. So this callback function here is the first argument of the setTimeout function. And so again, we do not call this function ourselves. We simply pass in this function as an argument to setTimeout. And it is this function who will then call our callback function in the future. And when does that future arrive? Well, that's what we specify here in the second argument. So here we pass in the amount of milliseconds that will pass until this function is called. So let's say we want to call this function after 3 seconds, and so we need to pass 3000. So 1 second is 1000 milliseconds, and so this is basically 3 times 1000. Okay, so let's give it a save, and you see the page reloaded. And now, after 3 seconds have passed, we get this log to the console. Okay, and so with this, we really delayed calling this function here, right, by exactly 3 seconds. And we can also say that we schedule this function call for 3 seconds later. All right. Now, what's really important to realize here is that the code execution does not stop here at this point. All right. So when the execution of our code reaches this point, it will simply call the setTimeout function. It will then essentially register this callback function here to be called later, and then the code execution simply continues. And we can prove that by doing something after the setTimeout. So let's say waiting. And if we now save this, then immediately we will see this waiting in the console. So let's check that. And indeed, we get waiting. And then after the 3 seconds, then this log here appeared. All right, so this is really important to understand. So again, as soon as JavaScript hits this line of code here, it will simply basically keep counting the time in the background and register this callback function to be called after that time has elapsed. And then immediately JavaScript will move on to the next line, which is this one. All right. And this mechanism is called asynchronous JavaScript. And we will talk about how exactly all of this works behind the scenes in a special section just about asynchronous JavaScript. Okay, but anyway, what if we now needed to pass some arguments into this function here? It's not that simple, right? Because we are not calling this function ourselves. So we are not using the parentheses like this, and so therefore we cannot pass in any arguments into the function. Right? Now, however, the setTimeout function here actually has a solution for that. And it works like this. So basically all the arguments here that we pass after the delay will be arguments to the function. So let me demonstrate that to you. So let's say here olives, and then another argument, spinach. And so here I can now specify the ingredients. So olives and spinach will be ingredients in our pizza. So let's say ingredient 1 and ingredient 2. And here we can then use them somehow. Let's make this a template literal. Let's give it a save here. And so the waiting once again appeared immediately. And then after 3 seconds, our string appeared locked to the console. And indeed, this third argument that we passed in did now become the first argument or the first parameter of our function here, and then the fourth argument became this second one. And if we passed in even more, we could then get access to them here in this callback function. All right, and that is essentially how the setTimeout function here works. There's just one more detail that I want to show you, which is the fact that we can actually cancel the timer at least until the delay has actually passed. So before these 3 seconds here have passed, we can cancel the timeout. And so let me show you how. Now to build this example, I first want to change something here. So I want to put the ingredients into an array. So let's say, again, olives and spinach. And so how would we then pass in these ingredients here? We're not going to do ingredients 0 and ingredients 1 like this, right? No. Instead, we will spread the array here using the spread operator. And so this will then take the elements out of the array and put them here basically comma separated. And so this now works exactly the same. But now what I want to do here is to say that if the ingredients include spinach, because that's something that many people don't like, so if the ingredients include spinach, then clear timeout. And so now here we need to pass in the name of the timer. And so we can basically assign this timer to a variable. So let's say simply, let's say pizza timer. And so here we can then use that variable, so that timer, to clear it. All right. So again, here we basically stored the result of the setTimeout function, which is essentially the timer, and then we can use that variable to clear the timeout. And then we can use that variable to basically delete the timer. And for that, we use clear timeout. And so now, since this array contains this spinach here, now you will not see the pizza string here printed to the console. All right. But if it did not include spinach, then of course, it would still work after 3 seconds. All right. So this is how the setTimeout function works. And that's actually it. That's all you need to know about the setTimeout function. It's pretty straightforward, right? So let's now actually go back to our application and implement a timer to simulate the approval of our loan. Okay, so when we click this button here to request a loan, then we get the value immediately right now. But typically a bank takes some time, like some days or some weeks, to approve that loan. And so let's simulate that here by taking like 2 or 3 seconds. So what happens when we successfully request a loan is essentially this code here, right? And so let's simply wrap all this code into a function. So curly braces, then function just like this, and then put all of this into a setTimeout. And then down here, give it a save, and then it should be nicely formatted. Okay, and now let's say, well, after 2.5 seconds. Okay, and so let's just see what it looks like in practice. So requesting a loan of 1,000. And so now it's going to take 2.5 seconds. And indeed, the bank just approved my loan here. So that was 10,000. Let's do something else. So count the seconds here. And now my loan was approved. And so then it appeared here in the movements, and it also appeared here in the balance. You saw that? So that makes our application a little bit more realistic. But let's go back now, because we also need to talk about setInterval. So we learned that setTimeout here simply schedules a function to run after a certain amount of time, but the callback function is only executed once. Now, what if we wanted to run a function over and over again, like every 5 seconds or every 10 minutes? Well, for that, we have the setTimeout function. So this one is going to be setTimeout. So let's use the setTimeout function to basically create a clock that will display in our console. So setTimeout, and then a function. And of course, I could have used an arrow function, but it doesn't really matter here. So our callback function, and let's create a new date here. So let's say now, and then new date. Okay, so this is nothing new at this point. And then let's just log that date, so that current date, to the console. And we want to execute this every 1 second. And so here we say 1 second. So let's see what happens. And indeed, once every second now, this should be executed. But it doesn't. And that's because I made the mistake of calling setTimeout again. But of course, as I was saying all the time, this one is actually called setInterval. So maybe you were already spotting this mistake. But now let's see what happens. So now, after each second here, we get the current time displayed to the console. So what's happening here is that this callback function is now executing every second. Okay? So every second a new date is created here and is then logged to the console. And of course, we could also say every 3 seconds. And then we would get the current time on the console every 3 seconds. You see? So it's adding 3 seconds each time now. But 1 second here makes a little bit more sense. Now, of course, you could print a real clock using this function now. Like you could get the current hour, minutes, and seconds from this now date. And so I would challenge you to do that actually, to take a minute or two in order to build like a real clock that is only logging the hours, minutes, and seconds here to the console. Now, I'm not going to do that here, but I think this would be a nice challenge to train a little bit the stuff that we've been using previously in the section. But for now, this is actually enough for this video. So take this challenge that I just mentioned, and then I'll see you soon in the next video. Welcome back. And this is going to be the last part of this project. So we're almost done here. Now, for security reasons, real bank applications will log out users after some inactive time. For example, after 5 minutes without doing anything. And that's what we will implement in this video using the setInterval timer. And let's start with one final look at our flowchart. So the timer appears in multiple places here, and the first one is right here. So whenever the user logs in, the logout timer will start or restart. All right. And then as soon as the logout timer expires, which will be after like 5 or 10 minutes, then we want to log the user out. All right. So basically that's what we will do with the timer. But let's start very simple. So the place where we want the timer is here in this function about the login. Okay, so this here is the handler function that handles the login. And so our timer will start here. Now we already have plenty of code here, as you see, right? And therefore, let's actually create a separate function which will start this logout timer. All right. So let's say start logout timer. And this function doesn't need any arguments. All it does is to basically export some functionality into an external function. So let's write some pseudocode here, basically by writing some comments to say what exactly we are going to do here. So we will start by setting the time to, let's say, 5 minutes. Okay. Then we want to call the timer every second. Then in each call, so in each callback call, print the remaining time to the user interface. And then when the time is at 0, so after the timer basically expired, so when we reach 0 seconds, stop timer and log out user. Okay, and to make this a bit easier to visualize, let's go again here to our demo application. And so the timer that I mean is this one here, which actually starts at 10 minutes. And you see that after each second, a new time is basically printed here. All right. And I'm not going to wait for 10 minutes now, but when this reaches 0, then the user will, of course, be logged out. Okay. So let's basically do everything that we described here. So I'm setting the time for now just to 10 seconds. Okay, just so we see what's going on. Or actually, let's say 100 seconds, so that we have actually more than 1 minute. Then we want to call the timer every second. So basically what this means is to use the setInterval function and then pass in a callback function, and this callback will be executed every second. And so 1000 milliseconds here. All right. Then each time that this function is called, print the remaining time to the user interface. And then this one here as well. So when we're at 0 seconds, stop the timer and log the user out. So we want to print the time here to this label, which is called label timer. So let me just show it to you here in our elements that I pre-selected. So label timer is the element with the selector of simply timer. Okay. So let's go. So label timer dot text content is equal to the time. And so that's this here. So I forgot to write the name of the variable actually. And now to make this actually work, we also need to remove 1 second in each of these function calls, right? So decrease 1 second. And so time equal time minus 1, which is essentially the same as saying time minus minus. All right. So this is the logic of this timer. We start with a certain number of seconds. Right now that's 100. And then each time that this callback function here is called, we remove 1 second from that. Okay. And so this is called every second. And so basically we will end up with a timer which shows the current number of seconds each second. Okay. And now all we need to do is to then call this function here on login. So, well, let's do that here before updating the UI. So start, logout timer. And now let's quickly log in here. And indeed, you see this number here decreasing now. Okay, so hopefully that that logic makes sense of decreasing 1 second every second. Now, where is that? We have too many functions here, I guess. Now, here we go. So again, the logic here is to decrease the timer by 1 second every second. And so therefore, we get this a number here going down by exactly 1 each second. All right. Now, we don't really want to see only the seconds. We want to see the minutes as well. So basically, we need to convert this simple number of seconds to minutes and seconds. All right. So let's do that here as well. So let's say the minutes is the current time divided by 60. So that's the easiest way, basically, of writing it. So it's not going to be correct, but it's going to show us what we need to do next. Now here we're also seeing already what happens with this timer after a certain number of seconds. So indeed, as soon as the time hits 0, it will not simply stop, right? We're not telling the timer anywhere to stop. And so it will simply continue and become negative. And so that's what we will have to implement then down here. But let's leave that for later. For now, we just want to display the number here in minutes and seconds. But for now, I will just show you the minutes, just to show you what we need to do next. So you see that we have 1 minute, 0.6 or 0.5 something. So it's decreasing every second, but this number here after the comma or after this period doesn't really make sense, right? So basically what we want to do is to take whatever remains of dividing the time by 60, because that will be our seconds. So let me show that to you as well. So seconds will be the remainder of dividing time by 60. And so that's where, again, the reminder function is very helpful. So the reminder operator, actually. So let's now print both of them here as a template literal. So minutes and then colon the second. Okay, and this is still far from being complete, but let's take it step by step here. So you see that this number here is now decreasing very nicely. And it started at 1 minute and 40 seconds. And that's exactly what 40 seconds is, right? So let's do this again, actually. And notice down there how it starts exactly at 1:40. So you saw that? And that 40 appeared because that is the reminder of dividing 100 by 60. So let's see it here in the console. So when we divide 100 by 60, then this is the result. But if we do 100, the remainder, then we get 40. All right? And that's because 1 times 60 plus 40 is then again 100. All right? Now here we actually do not want then this value after the comma, right? We are only interested in basically the integer. And so let's cut off that decimal part by saying math.trunc, all of this here. And then we also want to pad this number here with a 0. So for example, right now we are at 8 seconds or -8, but we want to see 0.8, just like in a normal clock. Okay, and for that we can again use the pad function. So let's convert this here to a string so that we can then call pad start, which should have the length of 2, and pad it with 0, or just the number is okay. And then the same here. And so now we should get a nice looking clock already. Let's actually start at 120 seconds, which is exactly 2 minutes. So you see now it's a nicely looking and nicely working clock, basically. So a countdown timer that starts counting from 120 seconds which is exactly 2 minutes. And so that's why in the beginning, the seconds is 0, because the reminder of doing 120 by 60 is 0, because 2 times 60 is exactly 120, right? So 2 times 60 is 120, and therefore there is no reminder. So there are no seconds in our case, okay? But let's not do it with only 10 seconds, because then we get that negative, and we can then work with that. So what we want to do here is, as soon as we reach 0 seconds, we want to stop the timer and log out the user. So if the time is 0, then we need to stop the timer. And we do that by using clear interval. So remember in the last video, we used clear timeout to stop the set timeout function. And now we can use clear interval to do the same with the set interval timer. All right. Now, in order to make this work, remember, we need to give a name to this timer. So let's simply call it timer. And then here we can use that variable to indeed stop that timer. And then we want to log out the user, which basically means setting the opacity of this whole container here back to 0. So here in our login, we did the opposite. So we set the opacity to 100. And now logging out the user basically means setting it back to 0. And here this text content should also be set to something else. So not the name of the current user. So let's copy that. And so here the welcome label should say login to get started, which is basically also the default that we see right now, right? And then the opacity back to 0. And remember that usually when we first see the application, all of this is actually invisible. And let's do that here, actually. So get rid of this fake always logged in. So we did that before to test our code, but now it's no longer necessary. And so this is how the application is supposed to look like in the beginning. So we logged in, and now our timer down here is running. And so let's just see what happens once it reaches 0. And indeed, we got logged out here. Okay, so that works beautifully. But let me log in again here so I can show you something that happens and that we need to fix. So as I log in, it takes quite some time until something happens here. Maybe you didn't catch that. So let me try it again after we get logged out here. So I will scroll down immediately and then I hit enter. So you see, before it was still at 1 second. So it was the value that we had before. And that happened because this entire function here is only first executed after 1 second, right? So this callback function that we passed into set interval is not called immediately. It will only get called the first time after 1 second. But in fact, we want to call this function also immediately, all right? And so the trick to doing that is to export this into a separate function, then call it immediately, and then also start calling it every second using the set interval function. So let me just show it to you. So I cut the function here. Let's put it here. So we need to give it a name. I'm calling it tick because that's a pretty common name. And now I put it here. And so right now everything is exactly the same as before. But what I wanted to do is to also call this immediately. And so this is how we do it. And so now right away this function gets called, and then after that every 1 second. And so let's try it now again. Let me scroll down here. And you see, this time we didn't have that problem. Now it's simply not counting down, but that's because I did this small mistake here, which you see is very common in development. You will do this also all the time. And well, now we didn't see at the beginning of the timer, but believe me, now it's actually working correctly. However, you might have noticed that we still have a problem, which is the fact that actually we get logged out once this hits 1 second. And so watch closely now what happens when we reach 1. You saw that? And so that's not what we want to happen. This should only happen at 0 seconds, not at 1 second. And the problem here is that we decrease this time by 1 second before checking for 0. So basically the problem here is that in the iteration here, so in the call where the time is 1, right? So here it's going to be 1, and then we decrease to 0, and then we check for 0. And so in this iteration where the time is initially 1, this part of the code still gets executed. And again, because we increase that 1 second to 0 here before this. And so we need to put it after, of course. And so now this part of the code here only gets triggered if the time really is 0 here in this whole function. So now you will see that the logout will only really happen after exactly 10 seconds. So you saw it reached 0, 0, and then we got logged out. Great. So let's increase this here a little bit. And then I will log in as this user. So you see that it's running. And now I will also log in as Jessica Davis, just to see you yet another problem that we have. So you see, it's weirdly alternating between these two numbers. And the reason for that is that right now we have basically 2 timers running at the same time. So 1 timer of Jonas and 1 timer of Jessica. And so that's not at all what we need, right? That's a big problem right now. So how can we fix this problem? Well, basically what we can do is that whenever we log a user in, we check if there is already a timer running, and if so, then we stop that timer. So I believe that is the best solution to this problem. And so what I'm going to do now is to return the timer from this function so that we can then use it here in this callback function of the login and delete it in case that it exists. So let me write that code actually, and then it's going to become a lot easier to understand. So here we will return the timer. And that's important because to clear the timer, so to use the clear interval function, we need the timer variable. And so therefore I'm returning it here. So let's then save it here. So that's down here. And so this is going to be the timer. Now we actually need this as a global variable. So let me put that outside here. So the current account and the timer. And the reason for that is that we need this variable to persist between different logins. So otherwise, after this handler function here would be ready, then the timer variable would disappear. So that's the reason why we have current account out here. And it's also the reason why we need to keep the timer out here. That's the only way in which we can then actually check if it appears. So timer and current account both need to be in the parent scope of this function scope. So let me show you what I mean. So here I will then set the timer to the timer that is returned here. However, if there already is a timer, I first need to clear it. And so let's do that. So if there is already a timer, then clear interval timer. And that's it. So let's think what happens when I log in first as Jonas. So when I log in now, there's going to be no timer, right? So in this situation, there was no timer already, was it? There wasn't, because I just logged out for the first time, and so no timer variable was created. But now, since I did log in, now timer is equal to that timer that I just exported from this function using the return keyword. And so this timer now does exist. And so when I now log in as someone else, so Jessica Davis, for example, then when the code reaches this line here, then a timer will indeed exist. And so then that timer is going to be cleared. Okay. And so now there is no problem anymore. Okay, so now it's running smoothly without any problem. And that, of course, also works when the timer here has a higher value. Let's put it back to 2 minutes. So I can now log in. The timer starts running normally. And when I log in then as Jessica, then the timer gets cleared and resetted basically, and it started again from 2 minutes. Okay. So all this might seem a little bit complicated, I know, but it's all kind of a matter of thinking about what we want our code to do. So all we're doing here is to use all the tools that we already know to basically achieve one goal that we want to achieve, which is in this case, this timer here running and being resetted each time that another user logs in. Now, another functionality that we want our timers to have is to basically reset once we do something in the account. Because remember, the goal of this timer here is to track the inactivity of the user. So the time where the user doesn't do anything. But if I do something, let's say transfer money, then we should not get logged out. It should be resetted. But as you saw, we still got logged out even after doing that transfer, of course. So what we need to do now is to also reset the timer whenever the user does a transfer or requests a loan. So these are the only two activities that exist in our application. And so these operations should always trigger the timer to be reset. Okay? So let's go here to the transfer. And let's do it here at the end. Reset the timer. So what does resetting the timer actually mean? Well, all we need to do is to basically clear interval using the timer that we already have, and then start it again. So clear interval, and then the timer variable. And so now one more time, it is important that this timer variable is actually a global variable. So a variable that's outside of any of these handler functions. So we define timer, remember, out here, because we didn't want it to be inside of this handler function here. And that was because we wanted this variable to persist throughout multiple logins. But now it's also important because we need it later for other operations. So inside other callback functions. And in particular in this one now. So clear interval of that timer that was defined previously, and then we simply start a new one. So basically we then overwrite that initial timer that we had before. So start, logout timer, and that's actually it. So imagine that the timer was at 1 minute 30 seconds. So when we do a transfer, that timer is cleared and a new timer is started again at 2 minutes. Okay, and now finally the same for requesting a loan. So let's try that. And now the timer is running down here. All right, and now let's try to transfer something to JD, so the other user, let's say 100, And watch what happens down here to the timer now. And indeed, it got resetted to 2 minutes. And the same when we request a loan, let's say 100. And then after the 3 seconds have passed, then our loan got approved indeed, and our timer reset to 2 minutes. Beautiful. Great. So our application is now actually finished and feature complete. Everything is working just as in our demonstration, and I think this was a great application to teach you really a lot of different stuff in JavaScript. So huge congratulations for finishing this great application. It's good to see that you made it to this point with me, and I hope that you're really proud of this application that you just built. You can now show it to all your friends and everyone that you're telling about your coding journey, and I'm sure they will be just as happy as you are about this amazing progress. So once more, great job and well done. And with that being said, I hope to see you soon in the next section where we're gonna build together some features of a real website. So UI components that you find commonly in normal websites, such as sliders or pop-up windows. So that's gonna be really exciting. So I hope to see you there soon.